Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening session of the 24th International Symposium on Law and Religion. Our theme this year is Religion and Religious Freedom in a Changing World. This theme gives us the opportunity to reflect upon the role that religion plays in building peace, stability, and harmony. Of course, we must acknowledge that religion can play a role in disunity and in violence. Similarly, freedom, religious freedom, can play both a positive and a negative role. Freedom gives troublemakers the space to make and plan their trouble. But as we learn from good social science research, religious freedom is one of the components of stable, harmonious, peaceful, and just societies. My name is Brett Sharffs, and I'm the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. My job this evening is easy. I'm going to introduce our university president, Kevin Worthen, our dean, Gordon Smith, and our founding director, Cole Durham, who will then introduce our keynote speakers this evening. Could I ask those by the back door to please shut the door so that we can reduce the noise coming in from the hallway? Kevin Worthen is not just the president of Brigham Young University, he is the former dean of this law school and a friend and mentor to many of us here. He has had a remarkable career, including undergraduate and law school at BYU. And after he finished BYU Law School, he went on to clerk for a United States Supreme Court justice, which is one of the great honors that any law student in the United States can have. Let me turn the time to President Worthen to welcome you.
Thank you, Professor Sharffs. It truly is a pleasure and an honor to invite you and welcome you to this 24th Annual International Law and Religion Symposium. We are honored here by your presence. And we're impressed at the university at the kind of discussion that's going to go on here. I've been involved in some of these and know the high level of discussion that happens on an important topic of religion and religious liberty in a changing world. As Professor Sharffs says, we know that religious belief is a part of most people's lives in the world. And for most of those people, it is an important part of their life that motivates them to do a lot of things. As Professor Sharffs said, sometimes that reality leads to cooperation, sometimes it leads to conflict. And what you're here to do is try and decide the dynamics, help us figure out the dynamics as to which of those situations will happen and the ways in which we can productively channel religion. It's appropriate that this kind of topic dealing with international norms of religious freedom takes place at this university. This university is founded by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think for the delegates, I heard a little bit of Professor Sharff's discussion, and you'll know that those who founded this university arrived here in this area precisely because they needed physical space in which to exercise their religion. And this university was founded nearly 140 years ago because of the idea that there ought to be a combination between secular learning and religious learning. And that continues to be an important part of what we do now. Brigham Young University is the largest, in terms of a campus, the largest religiously affiliated university in the United States. We have over 33,000 students here on campus. Hopefully you'll have the opportunity to visit with them. They are very bright, they are very talented, they are very friendly. Each of them, and each of the faculty members has agreed to live his or her life in accordance with standards of conduct that reflect the underlying values and principles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One other interesting feature you may notice here as you go to the breakout rooms here in the law school, you will notice that in some of them there are pianos. Music is not part of our curriculum at the law school. Those pianos are here because on the typical Sunday, these rooms are used for religious worship services for the students who attend here at the university. So this truly is a university that is religiously affiliated and very interested in religious freedom. It's also appropriate that we hold the symposium here because not only of our religious affiliation, but because of our international focus. We have students here on our campus from over 100 countries. Many of the countries that you represent will have students here. In fact, most of them will have students here from your country. 65% of our students speak a second language. That's not necessarily unusually high for many of the places you come from, but it is very high in the United States. And 16% of our student body speak at least 3 languages. We have, with over 140 programs in 55 countries, we have one of the largest study abroad programs in the United States. This is an area in which there is a lot happening internationally. And again, that's appropriate to recognize as we begin this. So I welcome you here with open heart, and hopefully we can have a dialogue in which we can look at this important issue of religious liberty in a way that will be productive for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Worthen. Our Dean, D. Gordon Smith, began his service about 18 months ago. He is a noted scholar in 3 fields of law: fiduciary theory, entrepreneurship, and in the emerging field of corpus linguistics, which uses large databases of historical legal materials to better understand the usage and meaning of words. Dean Smith came to Brigham Young University as a student many years ago, then graduated from the University of Chicago, and has taught at more than a half-dozen universities, both in the United States and abroad. If you corner him in the reception afterwards, ask him to list all of the universities that he's taught, including those outside the United States. You'll probably get hungry before he finishes going through that list. He is a visionary leader of the law school and a great friend of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Dean Smith.
Thank you, Brett. I really love this symposium, and I am so grateful to see all of you here. Welcome to the law school, and we very much appreciate this time of year because we know that we're going to have an opportunity to interact with you. The mission of this law school is to teach the laws of men in light of the laws of God. And as you can imagine, this is quite a significant challenge, as the laws on either side of that equation don't always line up. And so one of the things that we talk to our students about is the need to be empathetic and understanding of others in whom we engage in discussions. One of the great teachings of the LDS Church, in my view, is a teaching about spiritual gifts. We're told that every person is given gifts from God, and that to some is given one, and to some is given another, that all may be profited thereby. And when I see this assembly, I see a multitude of gifts, and I hope that as we come together and share those gifts with each other, we will be uplifted, that we'll be inspired, and that we will learn to rely on each other's gifts to make the world a better place. I wish you all the best in your associations here at the conference, and again, welcome to BYU Law School.
I began my service as director of the center 18 months ago. And from its beginning on January 1st, 2000, it's a nice date because we can remember it, my predecessor, colleague, and friend, Cole Durham, has been the director of the center. He is now founding director, which means that he continues to do most of what he did before and even more. my goal as director is to give him the space to do the things he does best, to be a scholar and to be a senior statesman on behalf of religion and the rule of law, religious freedom for all people in all places. Professor Durham began teaching at BYU Law School as a young man, very young, in fact. I'm not sure he ever stepped foot in a law firm before he came and started teaching at BYU Law School. He had his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and his law degree also from Harvard University. He then clerked for a federal judge and then came and began his career here as a comparative constitutional law scholar. In the late 1980s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, he was the secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law. And during the summer of, I believe it was 1989, he bought a rail pass and rode through the capitals of the former Soviet bloc countries, offering his services as a scholar of comparative law. And very quickly, he became a leading consultant on constitutional and legal reform projects in virtually every country of the former Soviet orbit. And that was the wellspring that grew more than a decade later into the launching of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. I arrived here at BYU 20 years ago, and a year later began teaching law and religion with Professor Durham, who has been my mentor and senior partner for all of these 20 years. And people sometimes ask, what is different now that you are director and Cole is founding director? And I said, well, it's like this. Before, Cole was my senior partner. And now, everything has changed. Cole is my senior partner. I'm very happy to introduce my senior partner, my friend and colleague, Cole Durham, who will introduce this evening's plenary speakers.
Well, it's a genuine pleasure for me to introduce our speakers this evening. Both have become very good friends and, among other things, are global figures in the field of law and religion and beyond. We will be hearing first from Ján Figeľ, the first special envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the European Union. Formerly, he served as a European Commissioner of Education, which, if one were to use a U.S. analogy, would be like being the Secretary of Education, but it's clearly one of the primary fields. He has also served as in various positions in his home country of Slovakia. He was the chief negotiator for Slovakia's accession into the EU and was also a representative of the Slovak government in the European Convention, which drafted the European Constitution. 2009, he was elected leader of the Christian Democratic Movement in Slovakia. I have to say he has extraordinary energy and he's exhibited that throughout his term as special envoy, which was recently renewed and extended. He's been I've seen him personally at numerous conferences, such as Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Bologna, twice in Bologna, Berlin, Morocco, Potsdam, and this is just a small part of the kinds of things he has been doing, really seeking to have an impact in building freedom of religion or belief around the world. I've known Professor Sajó even longer. We first met in 1991 at a program called Raising Rights Consciousness, which had been organized by Professor George Fletcher at Columbia, and it involved students from all over the former Central and Eastern Europe, the the former socialist bloc countries in that part of the world. We had a number of opportunities to work together over the next few years. He was the founder of the Legal Studies Department at Central European University and actually played a really significant role in the overall structuring and development of that university, where I've had the opportunity of working with him with, it's my favorite academic title, a recurring visiting professor of law, and I've recurred there every spring since 1994. I won't go into all the details of his academic background. This is in part because while Hungarian is phonetic, you have to still be able to pronounce it. But he has been the co-author of the leading case book on comparative constitutional law and of the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Constitutional Law, as well as the author of numerous other books and articles, one of which was largely drafted while he was spending a semester teaching here in the 1990s. He's taught at the NYU Law School as part of its prestigious global faculty and has also taught at Cardozo and held a research post at Stanford. Since 2008, he has been a judge on the European Court of Human Rights, clearly the most significant human rights court on earth with jurisdiction over 800 million people, stretching from Greenland to Vladivostok. He served as vice president of the court from November 2015 until his retirement from the court in 2017, and he's been one of the major intellectual leaders of that court. So without further ado, I'll turn it over first to Ján Figeľ and then to András Sajó.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President Worthen, dear Dean Smith, dear Brett, Director, dear friends. First, I want to express my deep thanks for invitation and for honor to speak here at the opening of BYU International Symposium, which became quite traditional, famous, and I think also very constructive and influential, not only in the academic community. I personally want to thank Col Durham and his collaborators and the medicines who helped me very openly when I recently got seriously ill. This was really a show of very brotherly assistance or solidarity. Thank you again and publicly. Religion, religious freedom, and changing world. My colleague, my friend András Sajó will speak more on legal and constitutional perspectives, dynamics in this area. I will focus more on political dimensions and social dimensions. Ladies and gentlemen, who does not understand religion, and especially abuse of religion, cannot understand what's going on in today's world. Religion is with the mankind since the beginning of history. It connects man with his beliefs, transcendency, but also relates and unites. In Latin term, religare, unites into community, into faith community. According to recent Pew Research Center figures, 84% of the world population claim religious affiliation. This is overwhelming majority. On all continents in Europe, in spite of the perceived secularization, according to the latest Eurobarometer statistics on religiosity, we can say that majority of European citizens feels an affiliation to a religion or a faith. So we can really say it's really significant phenomenon in 21st century. It is an ineradicable condition of human lives and human society providing a set of values by which many individuals and communities govern themselves. At the European Union level, this is recognized even in the Treaty on Functioning of the European Union, which mandates a regular dialogue between the European Union and churches, religious and associations and communities, as well as philosophical and non-confessional organizations. Many voices say that religion is back in our globalized world. Religion is back with new forms and in new ways, affected by global changes, surfing social media, and digitalization. We observe new powerful trends cutting across religion as fundamentalism, spiritualism, charismatic movements. New lenses, new concepts are needed to understand this complexity. So, few words and messages about FORB, as we say in European and more in international terms, in a changing world. FORB, freedom of religion or belief, is a litmus test of all human rights, because it's freedom of thought, conscience, religion, conviction. It speaks directly about dignity of human person, which is born free. It is expansive right because it speaks about other rights as well. It's linked to right to assembly, right to association, right to expression. It covers also non-believers and conversion. It is implemented individually and collectively. Respect of human rights is not possible without respecting freedom of religion or belief. All dictators, all terrorists are happy when FORB is restricted or non-existing. 4 most inhuman dictators in the 20th century bloodily oppressed and violated FORB. It was Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot. Unfortunately, in the FORB community, we are getting used to daily bad news. FORB is under pressure, indicators are worsening. We all witness tragedies, even genocides around us. We have global statistics showing a gloomy picture. Let me share you a reminder of few. 2 years ago, because this is the latest data, 40% of countries had high or very high level of restrictions on freedom of religion. But these countries represent 74% of global population, 3/4 of mankind, with high restrictions on FORB. The percentage of countries with high or very high levels of social hostilities increased 2 years ago from 23% to 27%. 105 countries, majority in the world, experienced widespread government harassment of religious groups. Government use of force against religious groups increased as well in last years. There is also a new growing trend of non-state actors, very violent, oppressive in numbers and in influence. I will mention Taliban, so-called Islamic State, Al-Nusra, Boko Haram, and there are many others. We can read more precise figures and reports from United Nations, European Union, from European Parliament Intergroup on FORB, from Aid to Church in Need, from Open Doors, Human Rights Without Frontiers, US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and many organizations. Critical is situation on religious freedom in many regions, in many countries, like North Korea, Pakistan, Somalia, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Myanmar. There are new concerns also in Russia through the ban of Jehovah's Witnesses. So all continents could be mentioned and individual cases or tendencies. scale of these oppressions go from intolerance through discrimination to persecution up to genocide. This term I use openly and critically because it's also a reality mentioned by many institutions in today's world. The recent report of UN Rapporteur on FORB draws attention on following. Almost half of countries have laws penalizing blasphemy, apostasy, or defamation of religion. In 22 countries, there is still use of death penalty for apostasy. In at least 13 countries, capital punishment for atheists. Non-believers are more and more under oppression. Unfortunately, at the same time, within United Nations human rights universal periodic review process, only 2.5% of adopted recommendations deal with the FORB violations. Recently, US Commission on International Religious Freedom published a study on blasphemy laws in 71 countries. Majority of laws contain moderately to clearly uneven criminal punishments ranging from prison sentences, lashings, forced labor to death penalty. Blasphemy laws are vaguely worded and increasingly misused for political reasons. So what are the main messages of this input or introductory part? First, freedom of religion or belief situation in the world is critical in many parts of the world. And secondly, trends are worrying. Trends are negative. Moreover, migration, whether voluntary or forced migration, has reached record high numbers recently. 245 million people is on the move. 65 million people as forced on their move for new destinations. The world is really changing. Recently, one professor in Rome mentioned, time comes to think about the need of religious climate change. Religious climate change. Situation is very worrying, trends are negative, so either we are aware and do something, or then we face consequences. If we want to improve global situation and global trends, we need to embrace credible change, to embrace and to overcome what is ignorance and illiteracy, prejudices, divisions, and work for peace, justice, sustainable development, and human dignity for all and everywhere. There are also some good news. For example, Marrakesh Declaration, adopted last year, that's a very important list of principles for behavior of majorities versus minorities in Muslim societies. These declarations, like Marrakesh or Rabat or Beirut, need to be implemented. Some Gulf countries make steps towards religious plurality and gender equality. For example, Saudi Arabia now announced women may become car drivers. So simple, but important for reality, for daily lives, for equality. In Tunisia, women are allowed to marry non-Muslims, to marry out of state religion. So changing world, is it a threat or is it a promise? It depends. With worrying trends, of course, we will have more and more problems and victims of the situation. But we have a say on this. My father and my grandfather would love to have my crisis, difficult time of our discussions. Rate of our responsibility depends on the rate of our influence. As citizens, professors, policymakers, judges, rate of our responsibility depends on the rate of our influence individually and collectively. This is the departure point. So we can make a difference. We have influence. We can turn down negative tendencies. We should at least do utmost for a better world, be more mature in our responsibilities. So what to do? Flying here with Delta, I've seen movie Promise. I think some of you or many of you have seen this. It is on Armenian mass atrocities in 1915, 1916. Last year, 2016, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, European Parliament, United States Congress, United Kingdom and Australian parliaments adopted strong, clear, unequivocal resolutions on the situation in the Middle East, namely on the territories under ISIS dominance in Iraq and Syria, naming it as a genocide committed by ISIS militants. I mention it because decades ago, our predecessors promised never again in facing such inhumanities. This was our predecessors' promise and remains our commitment under international law and the national laws. We failed. We failed again and again and again. In Europe, Balkans, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Middle East. We failed in all three P principles or P commitments to the persecuted people: to prevent, to protect, and to punish. To prevent from mass atrocities, to protect victims of such situations, and to punish perpetrators. Iraqi government in May last year, count number of months since May last year, asked in the Security Council for international team to investigate ISIS crimes on the territory of Iraq. It was adopted only now, more than a week ago, in New York. May take time, may take years, decades, but justice is always important. Peace is fruit of justice. Peace is fruit of justice, locally and globally. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide accuse dictators and totalitarian regimes, but in some way also entire international community, at least from inefficiency, from slow or no action whatsoever. Ladies and gentlemen, evil has strong, very influential allies, well-placed everywhere, in politics, in academia, in society, in religious groups, on top and grassroots levels both. We all know them very well. Three evil allies are decisive: ignorance, indifference, and fear. Ignorance, when we don't know; indifference, if we don't care; and fear, if we are scared, afraid to say something or to do something on behalf of voiceless or defenseless people in favor of truth, justice, and humanity. Ignorance, indifference, and fear are interrelated. They are like siblings. And they hate courage, education, and responsibility. So what to do? And here I would like to focus on my final points. First, we should not fail again to deliver on our promises, on our commitments, on our duties, responsibilities, to abandon again the persecuted, accept impunity of criminals. Human rights will not work with such attitudes, or will not work without attitudes, which means commitments, without international community, mature citizenship, and institutions of law enforcement on duty, because each right has also duty. It can work only in balanced situation. Then we need to understand that religion is part of solution, and religious freedom, or FORB, is a great important instrument for positive change. It's not a question, it's not a problem, it's the answer. I'm convinced, for example, that with credible contribution of faith-based actors, we cannot fulfill objectives of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Agenda 2030 without faith-based actors and their contribution. SDGs will remain on paper. Therefore, we support religious dimension, very innovative approach with G20 side events. That is why we established after 25 years, after 25-year tradition, Lorenzo Natali Media Prize in European Union for FORB journalism, whether professional or amateur, to raise awareness, to show examples, to motivate, to inspire. When I speak about religious freedom, I always mean responsible, mature freedom, because freedom without responsibility cannot work, cannot exist. Like rights are not possible without duties. I will now move in the field of a bit of mentality and morals, but also speak for curricular, educational, legal, political thinking and reforms. First, about common good. Secondly, about responsibility of political and religious leaders. And thirdly, about the importance of fair, secular state. I think common good is frequently forgotten, abandoned, underestimated value, very important principle for European integration, for European future, but I mean also international, global future and cooperation. I think common good should be promoted instead of superiority or supremacy, because it speaks about win-win policy instead of winner takes all or zero-sum game. When we see common good, we usually find common ground, then we find common interests, then we find common solutions, even common victories, common future. These are fruits of common good. Mentality of superiority means my nation first, my country first, my club first, or religion, my race, my tribe, tend to lead to policy of supremacy. And in worst case, even to ideology of supremacy. From ideology, there is a very shortcut, short way to prejudices, unequal treatment, hatred, and even violence. Historia magistra vitae est. Identity has a value only when there is somebody different. Within uniformity, what kind of identities are important? Numbers? Diversity is a defining principle for entire humanity, even within a family. Children are different from parents. We all are different, but we all are born equal in dignity and rights. We all are one mankind, and collectively we are sometime, somewhere, a clear minority. Status or treatment of minorities is one of the objective criteria of majority culture and behavior and criterion of good governance. This is true also in relation to religious minorities. 4 is intrinsic part of human dignity and common good. And human dignity is first fundamental value where all sincere, real humanists should meet together, whether they are religious or secular. We need to reiterate common space between religion and human rights. Shared origins, concepts, values, and goals. And global list of this reiteration has a name. It's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Secondly, from politics of identities to politics of responsibilities, or more nicely expressed, from language on identities to ethics of responsibility. Interfaith dialogue with religions is important. It must encompass several principles in order to bear fruits for respect and diversity. The first one is refusal of violence. Violence as instrument of solving the differences. Second, acceptance of religious freedom, including freedom to convert. And third is separation of religion and politics, or religion and state power. European Union has no hesitation to protect and promote freedom of religion, as it is well aware that faith leaders are, on their side, committed to respect the sovereignty of democratic political institutions. Institutionalized religion has no political ambitions in today's European societies, just as, in turn, political institutions uphold the duty to protect the rights of all religious communities. They know that defending their rights is an obligation of the state powers that is enshrined in the most of our European constitutions. And this is the first and most fundamental contribution religious communities can make to democracy, respecting the independence and sovereignty of democratic state institutions. But in turn, democratic rule of law also has to mean the protection of all fundamental rights, including religious freedom. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, I quote. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This is the first article, the most important beginning of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It resonates fully with the very core of all major religious faiths. All human beings are endowed with dignity. They are born free and equal in dignity, which no human power can neither bestow nor withdraw. And human institutions, including political institutions, can only acknowledge and solemnly declare it. I want to state my conviction that the amalgamation of terrorism and religion is wrong, and no Holy Scripture or religious tradition should be held accountable for the horrible actions some fanatic and obscure militant groups or individuals perpetrate in the name of that religion. But words of political leaders don't hold the same authority as the public statements of faith leaders when they publicly denounce political violence perpetrated in the name of God. I just want to mention several of them which were very clear, active, and vocal on these matters, like Pope Francis, Grand Mufti Al-Taib of Al-Azhar, or Dalai Lama and others on their levels. This is a shared responsibility, a goal we will only achieve if we work together, religious leaders, policymakers, lawmakers, judges, academics, journalists, civil society activists. And the third is fair state. Fair state preserving peace, security, good governance for all. Such state is needed. As religions are moving, society is changing, we indeed need to learn how to deal with cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity, how to build cohesive and respectful societies. We need to learn to live in diversity, not only to exist in diversity. Religious literacy is a must for a shared society, a necessary competence for good education, for mature citizenship, because uniformity and ignorance breeds intolerance. And from intolerance, there is a very short connection to radicalization and violent extremism. This we have to keep in mind, especially with our children and young generation. There are many inspiring examples of successful educational and youth initiatives aimed at de-radicalization. We embrace the world which is a living mosaic, not a melting pot, and society is a mosaic in small. In order to organize such living together, to realize, to implement diversity in unity, we need a state which is fair and just to all. It is civil or secular state instead of religious or ethnic. I was very happy this year in Iraq, in Erbil, and in Najaf, when I spoke to Grand Ayatollah al-Najafi and then to Chaldean Patriarch Louis Raphael Sacco, and they used almost the same language, speaking about future of Iraq as a civil state based on citizenship, on equality for all citizens. The name of Iraq today and the situation there is still far from this ideal. But when the religious leaders use this language and they drive their communities towards such solution, I think we can see it on the horizon of constitutional reforms. We need it. Iraq needs that. Middle East needs that. In this respect, it's important to revisit the very idea of secularism and laicite, because secularism cannot become an ideology. It must not become an ideology. Secularism cannot mean a replacement of religions, but state openness for plurality. Fair secularism opens and organizes space for religion and belief. Unfair secularism closes the public space for religion. I add my voice to those responsible leaders and scholars who refuse divisive simplifications in our academic, political, and media discussions of unreconcilable differences between civilizations and logically of necessary future clash of civilizations. We do not need clash of civilizations, but definitely we need more civilization, more knowledge about and dialogue among cultures, religions, and civilizations, because there exists a potentially very risky clash of ignorance. If we do not understand, if we do not know, and even are not interested to know the others. Therefore, I welcome BYU professional commitment on law and religion studies, here and also in the world. I assisted to launch European Academy of Religion in Bologna this year. I support the International Consortium on Law and Religion Studies because I think they do a great job in the world on our continents. I already mentioned welcoming remarks on Marrakesh Declaration and Beirut Declaration. Ladies and gentlemen, international community is determined to fight for freedom of religion. I think I can say it very clearly. This is European Union, this is United Nations, OSCE, International Parliamentarians Platform for 4, Commonwealth Initiative on 4, democratic countries, NGOs, advocacy, civil society organizations. We are convinced that religion is in itself a force for good and knows that the wide majority of religious faithful are peace-loving, respectful of other people's rights and fundamental liberties. This is indeed the conviction of the European Union. We are major sponsors of 4 resolutions in the United Nations, New York, and Geneva negotiations. Behind the adoption of the European Union guidelines on 4 promotion in June 2013. And more recently, the reason behind my appointment as the first special envoy for 4 outside of the European Union. In several member states, there are different representatives and observatories established to deal with 4 internationally. We in the European Union strongly believe that it is possible to turn the situation around. Yes, we are all well aware of the threats and risks our world is confronted with. We are not naive. We know that it will be a difficult fight, as the enemies we are now facing are not the same previous generations had to engage with. Today, they don't show any respect for international law. They don't shy away from using humanitarian workers, in some cases even defenseless women and children, as human shields. We are now facing a new kind of violent extremism who respects no law and has no regard for the very notion of humanity, and does not hesitate to use terror and suicide bombing to kill innocent civilians as a means to achieve political goals. And this point is key. Terrorists are not religious people. They abuse religion and abuse religious feelings. Theirs is a political struggle driven by the will for power and the urge to dominate others. And this is one of the main reasons why we are resolved to fight violent extremism and terrorism with all means at our disposal, and at the same time committed to protect for, not either or, but to protect for as an instrument. We know that religion, meaning also institutionalized religion, has been a force for peace, democracy, and respect for human dignity over recent times in our continent and generally in the world. The world is indeed changing, and change brings with it also a worrying level of uncertainty, even conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, but there is one thing that does not change and should not change: our shared commitment to upholding human dignity for all and everywhere, and to protect fundamental human rights. And I thank you all for your work and your cooperation in this field. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think it will not be a major surprise to declare that I feel honored to be here. It's a real privilege because I think to participate in this very successful program, which is now at its 24th edition, if I'm not mistaken, is something rather unique. But it's also a unique opportunity for me personally, because it enables me to work together with the center led by our friend Brett, and in particular because it gives me the opportunity to express my gratitude to Cole Durham, my dear friend. I would like to dedicate this lecture to him because I think I'm not the only person present here who learned from him the importance of tolerance based on listening. And that is a major virtue, something that I think is inspired by his work and attitude. In a world where persecution of people on religious grounds is a daily tragedy, the difficulties and conflicts I'm going to describe are small inconveniences. In other words, I will not trouble you with tragedies which will destroy not only your appetite, and I know I am the only person standing between you and the reception, but even cause nightmares. I think this is the most serious problem freedom of religion and, in a certain sense, humanity is facing, but my experience is limited to Europe, and I will only talk about a special aspect of freedom of religion related to what I see to be a phenomenon of demise of liberty. That demise, that decline of liberty is affecting freedom of religion. And so I will discuss that problem from a very provincial perspective, that is to say Europe, problem of established constitutional democracies based on, again, a very limited religious experience based on Judeo-Christian religious tradition. And I know that this is a very limited experience. And I apologize once again. I know that this is provincialism, and it has to be taken as such. Nevertheless, this being a scholarly venture, there are interesting elements occurring in that small part of the world. And these interesting elements concern changes in the ways religions operate, but also concern a shift in constitutional values to the detriment of liberty. And this is what I intend to flag. Liberty served as the foundational value for modern Western law. It shaped constitutions as we know them in democratic countries. These constitutional democracies accepted, at least in principle, that liberty is a matter of personal choice of action without any official authorization, and liberty is limited only by the equal liberty of others. However, in the last decades, there seems to be less social and legal interest in freedom, which is complacently taken for granted in so-called mature democracies. People's interests are expressed more and more in terms of identity and welfare, to the extent that even religious beliefs are often claimed only as part of one's personal identity. In the contemporary Western narcissistic culture, the cult of identity may have had detrimental effects on liberty-based rights. Dignity, which rightly demands equal respect to all, is sometimes turned into a justification of idiosyncratic desires and whims. And identity claims are not the only competitor of liberty. Personal and social security claims too compete with individual freedom. The popularity of these competitors of liberty, as well as the extension of the public sphere and government services, has important consequences on freedom of religion, in particular, the freedom to manifest religion. And so, first, I would like to mention impacted freedoms. This is quite well known both for lawyers and the general public. And here, I would like only to refer to security-based restrictions on religious speech or teachings. It is well known, for example, that in countries like Singapore, traditionally, that is to say from the 60s, materials of Jehovah's Witnesses were and are systematically confiscated, and this is justified as being necessary to protect society against subversion. And this term, subversion, comes up in many countries where teaching of religion is controlled by the state. There are many countries where proselytism is prosecuted or the registration of religious organizations is denied because of alleged subversive tendencies or being qualified as an affront to national identity. In many countries, including constitutional democracies, the current security scare concentrates on the teaching of doctrines of Islam. It is argued that radical religious teachings which seem to advocate violence, or not even seem to advocate violence, but there is some kind of alleged or real association, are to be prohibited. Now, these attempts of preventing subversion remind me of a dilemma the West faced in the days of Nazi and communist propaganda. Prior restraint and criminalization of the advocacy of so-called subversive doctrines are very sad pages of the history of freedom of speech. Today, the advocacy of jihad and teaching, or certain teachings of Islam, are aggravated by the fact that contrary to communist indoctrination and propaganda, here we are dealing with a religious doctrine, ambiguous as it may be. And being religious means that this is prima facie protected. Of course, all protected teaching and manifestation of religion can be abused. But fact is that security concerns may destroy the current frame offered to all religious teachings, because once you single out one religion, the same approach may become generalized. Sorry for the slippery slope argument. Genuine freedom of expression means that prior restraint is appropriate only where there is clear and present danger of an illegal, violent act. Is this going to remain the standard in front of brainwashing? Of course, I'm not advocating immunity for radical preachers, nor passivity in front of terrorist propaganda masquerading as religious teaching. But there is a clear danger that the new norms developed in the name of security will apply across the board for any religious teaching that is not preferred by the majority or by the state or security agencies. And they will be labeled subversive, even if they don't advocate violence. And that is a major concern for freedom of religion. Now let me turn to some problems related to the cult of personal identity and to the activities of the welfare state, which is often serving those identity demands. Based on new human orientations, new human rights were created in the last 20 to 30 years. Human rights are mushrooming, and that results in a rights inflation. According to the prevailing human rights doctrine, all human rights are equal. Liberty and liberty-related rights have lost their priority, and that has an impact on freedom of religion being a liberty. Now, religious manifestations occur today in a very extended public sphere with considerable penetration into private relations. Many of those penetrations occur in the name of these new rights. Such extension increases the tension with religious rights. Why is that so? Beyond prescribing specific forms of worship, religions command external action, a conduct of life that overlaps with ordinary human conduct. Rules on food consumption, especially relating to meat or mind-altering drinks. External appearance, burqa, veil, and their progeny. These are the most often mentioned. And social interaction, procreation, marriage, divorce, family, gender relations. These govern parts of life which are also subjects of public concern and public order. It is not surprising that freedom of religion often comes into conflict with the prevailing forms of public order, especially where public order is secularized. That is to say, it is based on considerations alien to religious logic. Such conflict, by the way, is also common where there is a majority religion that is accepted as prevailing by the state. In that case, the dictates of that majority religion become oppressive for the other religions, becoming the standard of ordinary life. Now, the possible legal answer to that was that you restrict the scope of religious manifestations. If the scope of religious manifestations is restricted, then, of course, the conflict is legally diminished, but at the cost of freedom of religion. The legal concept of manifestation varies considerably, even within one country. But to use the American example, generally, at least in some periods, there is a rather broad concept of this manifestation. Take a 1940 case, Cantwell versus Connecticut, decided by the Supreme Court of the United States. Here, the issue was a preliminary authorization of solicitation for donations on the street. Now, there is nothing distinctly religious in soliciting, as it can serve any purpose, not only religious. But it was taken for granted already in 1940 that if it is claimed that the soliciting serves religion or religious purposes, then it is a matter of religious exercise, manifestation. Similar to this early US position, in a recent case of the European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court, concerning France, the court, my court, accepted that wearing a burqa is religious manifestation, without examining the claim from a theological perspective, although many anthropologists and imams are of the view that this wearing of the burqa is simply a local custom, it's not a religious obligation. But the court, I think rightly, said that we are not here to challenge the assumption, the claim made by those who claim that this is a religious manifestation. I would like to add, however, that law is never as certain as it claims to be, and the European Court is of the view that not every act motivated or inspired by a religion or a belief is protected as religious manifestation. Perhaps the Strasbourg Court does not wish to allow each individual to be a god to herself. Moreover, in this logic, I quote, if a person is able to take steps to circumvent a limitation placed on his or her freedom to manifest religion or belief, there is no interference with freedom of religion. So in other words, if you can behave in a way that is not, that you can somehow overcome the requirements of the religion, that's not a problem. Now, I think that this is a position that does not take seriously the hardship imposed on believers. In other words, is disrespectful. But that's the position, or seems to be the position, of the European Court. Now, even a relative ease to accept that a conduct is religious, as it was shown in the French burqa case, does not determine the level of protection granted. Not only in Europe, but also in the United States. If you take a case called Employment Division versus Smith, there it was said, yes, it might be, it's a religious exercise, no question about that. But that is not a ground for imposing an obligation on the state to depart from general rules. For those who are not familiar with this case, this is about Indians whose religion required the use of a peyote, which is a drug. The law, the general law, imposed certain sanctions on those who use drugs. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, okay, this is a neutral law, and there is no exception that would follow from the Constitution in favor of those who use peyote as part of religious manifestation or worship. By the way, today, state laws do enable such practices. So at state law level, after complicated legal battles, this is granted as part of restoration of freedom of religion. But in Europe, in the already mentioned French burqa prohibition case, the European Court said that this is in conformity with the European Convention concerning freedom to manifest. So in Europe, again, they did not consider necessary to grant a religious exception. It is claimed in the name of national or popular sovereignty that people are the source of power, and people have sovereign power to determine what is proper in the public and, moreover, what is to be considered public. It is assumed that in the public sphere, public order shall prevail. Now, this is a departure, I think, from the original liberal idea or ideal of liberty. And by liberal, I don't mean the American term, which is social democracy from a European perspective. I mean 19th century freedom-based social order. A French writer, after the French Revolution in the early decades of the 19th century, Benjamin Constant, claimed that there is a sphere of privacy, a private sphere, where the state has no power to interfere. That's an absolutely protected private sphere. And that shall be limited only by concerns of the liberty of other people. It is not, he did not mean, or liberalism did not mean, that liberty is limited to the private sphere. The public sphere also has to respect freedom. Here, in the public sphere, however, freedom and even fundamental rights are subject to regulation, at least as much as it is needed to sustain order and functionality of the public sphere. But it is assumed about this public sphere in a democratic version of the liberal order that people have equal access, and that means all religions have equal access to and use of the public sphere. This is particularly important for the freedom to manifest religion. An individual or collective action or conduct cannot be hampered or discriminated against for being religious. It is part of free exercise that religions and religious organizations are present in the public sphere, and it is for this reason that registration of religious organizations becomes at least suspect, even if such registration may be necessary or useful for general purposes under general laws. For example, when charities apply for tax exemption. That's a very specific purpose related to a very secular function of the state. So what are the possibilities of religion in a world where this distinction between public and private is not sustainable anymore because the state, the welfare state services make society dependent and the individual dependent on those services? Perhaps once upon a time there was a possibility to rely on the shelter of the private for freedom of religion. That is to say, to claim that religious manifestations are private and the state has no business in this sphere. And church autonomy, I think, is an attempt to carve out immunity for activities on this basis. Church autonomy is a kind of insisting on the private nature of religion. But this does not solve the problem of the individual who would like to carry out a manifestation in public life. It does not solve the problem of conduct outside the religious organization. Moreover, the privatization of religion is not attractive for many religions and circumstances. In many instances, churches have simply refused to give up their influence over the public sphere. Dominant churches, historically dominant churches, are understandably not tempted by the privatization of religion. It is argued that given the political nature of the state, the protection of the religion and of the freedom to manifest requires public presence, and the religious positions need to rely on the democratic political process to protect free exercise. Moreover, a discourse with other social actors, religious and secular communities, in the spirit of mutual respect or tolerance also necessitates a presence in the public sphere. This is what enables living together in mutual respect. So while in principle, large private sphere within a minimal state, free religion in a free state, would ideally place the manifestation of religion into private sphere, this solution runs into practical and perhaps insurmountable difficulties in the contemporary welfare state. For the bureaucratic regulator, uniformity that promises neutrality is the most convenient form of regulating the public square. With the judicial attitude exemplified in the already mentioned Employment Division versus Smith's judgment, the Peyote case, the protection to religious conduct in the public sphere is rather limited or subject only to majority will. Now, this is not satisfactory from the perspective of liberty, including religious freedom. Respect of liberty would require as much accommodation as is compatible with all other religions and fundamental rights of others. In the logic of equal liberty, for example, where religion dictates halal or kosher butchering or peyote or sacramental wine, these demands of public conduct are to be respected as long as this is comparable with other people's freedom. And this toleration, the toleration of such practices entails a respect, the toleration of the emotionally troubling. The fact that a behavior is emotionally troubling for others cannot be a sufficient ground for restriction. There is no actual harm. Ordinary emotional discomfort does not amount to a foundation of a personal claim. So, just to give you an example, consider animal rights. I fully accept that all forms of cruelty, including against animals, is outrageous. But not all outrage is generating fundamental rights. Nevertheless, in a number of countries, legislation prohibits slaughtering in a religiously mandated way in the name of protecting animal rights. the history of similar laws indicates this is often motivated by group bias against a minority religion. Today, when the legislator gives preference to animal rights vis-à-vis freedom of religion or religious manifestation, it expresses the personal preferences of some people, for whom the well-being of animals is a matter of their personal identity. They identify themselves with those concerns. Again, I'm not criticizing that. I find that very relevant. But is this enough for generating a fundamental right that can counter and prevail against freedom to manifest? In some instances, courts have declared such laws discriminatory in view of the anti-minority, that is to say minority religion, anti-minority animus of the legislation. This was the case with the Santeria religion in the United States in the case of the Church of Lukumi Babale Aye. More recently, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal found that the Animal Protection Act, which was justified as an act of public morality and not yet as a matter of animals' rights or the right of animal lovers, was disproportionately restrictive of free exercise. Now, I would like to mention that there are a number of possible policies for religion to assert itself. One is the extension of the private sphere. I was referring to that already. And the second one is to carve out, in the name of accommodation, or restructure the public sphere. That is to say, to insist on the legitimacy of religious or religion-motivated conduct in the public sphere. In one Turkish case, I recall from 2010, the European Court of Human Rights was confronted with the wearing of religious garb in Turkey, a religious garb that was prohibited by the Constitution. This was Kemal Atatürk's revolution, and certain religious sects and their garb were prohibited, and that's in the Constitution. Now, we said that a very unpleasant group of people who were marching around in a certain city, who were not considered, not well received by the authorities, were marching in the garb in order to get to the mosque. I must say that they went around twice, but that's all right. So we said, because this was related to a religious function, their presence in the public square has to be respected. So we introduced into the public square, into the public space, an exception. In a way, we turned the public space for that specific function into a religious space. So that's a second strategy to handle this matter. The third strategy is to adjust the public sphere to accommodate private religious manifestations. Again, a European Court of Human Rights case is called Evada, where we have accepted the right of a stewardess to wear a rather large crucifix on the airplane, because she was a stewardess, in violation of the business policies of the employer. The employer, the airline, intended to, by prohibiting the wearing of the crucifix, intended not to embarrass some of its customers. So this was a proprietary interest, business interest, and this was held secondary in view of the right to manifest. interestingly, in this case, we were confronted with a semi-private sphere. The airplane was, in a way, privately owned, but it was open to the general public. And in this case, we said that we extend the concern of manifestation to this semi-private sphere, as if it were a fully public sphere, and there the freedom of manifestation applies. However, in the burqa case, when it came to embarrassment caused by the burqa on the street, the proportionality considerations which prevailed in Aveda did not prevail. There, the idea of manifestation of religion was not held to be an important interest enough. Now, I would jump to conclusions, a very short conclusion indeed, given the hour. It seems to me that the traditional practical solutions dictated by mutual private liberty is that of toleration. Tolerance is or shall be a central concept of and for freedom of religion. From mutual tolerance to differences in conduct, a general duty of the state to provide accommodation for religious conduct in everyday life emerges. Such accommodation shall apply whenever necessary and possible. And it follows from a general concept of the primacy of liberty. Without accepting the primacy of liberty, this will not work. One can only hope that participants in the democratic process, including religious participants, will understand the moral superiority and practical advantages of this dictate of liberty. Thank you for your interest.
Well, for those of you who have been coming to the symposium over the years, you know that we have a tradition of remarkable, insightful, and memorable opening addresses. And I'd like to thank our two presenters today, two of the great public intellectuals of Europe, for raising the bar of that standard. Ján Figeľ addressed really one of the key important principles, the cornerstone of human rights thinking, of human dignity. And I think we'll all reflect carefully upon his invocation of the face of evil that afflicts our age, the face of ignorance, the face of indifference, and the face of fear. Those are indeed evils with which we are all familiar. And Professor Sajó, in his usual optimistic way, warns us of a really dangerous assault on liberty, which we do sense around us in deep and troubling ways. He likewise identified three primary assaults: the assault of security, the assault of identity, and the assault of welfare. And these are insidious because each of these are important values. But when they become values to be maximized or exaggerated, then they do indeed create a genuine threat to the basic fundamental principle of liberal constitutionalism, which is the protection of individual liberty. So we've been given a lot to think about, and I think we've been given a very good springboard for our discussion over the next 2.5 days. So as we close this session and go to our reception, let me just remind you that there will be shuttles and vans beginning in about 15 or 20 minutes. So for those who are tired, you can return soon to the hotel. We do begin on the early side tomorrow, our first morning plenary session, which will address the topic of freedom and security, begins here at 8:30. So we really need you to be leaving the hotel by about 8 o'clock, getting here, getting your headsets, and being ready to have a long and full day of engagement tomorrow. Let me ask you to once again join me in thanking Special Envoy Ján Figeľ and Professor András Sajó. And now let me invite you to go downstairs one level for our reception, which will be in the main atrium area.
Very well prepared.